Okay, pop culture, we are now in part two of our 1980s decade overview. And if you recall, in part one, we covered um, our economic issues of the 80s with Reaganomics and the pros and cons of that with our president's policy with the economy. Okay, so what else is going on in the 1980s? Star Wars is going on. Well, the movie Star Wars came out in the late 70s, and the sequels to that movie are coming out in the 80s. So that's how it gets the nickname Star Wars. But what we're actually talking about in this bullet is the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was known as SDI, or the media gives it the nickname Star Wars. And so remember, in the 1980s, we are still in the Cold War. And so Reagan's administration had this awesome idea of let's make missile defense that float in space. And so when the Soviets, if they ever attempted to send a missile or a nuclear bomb our way, our space defense system could shoot it down in space before it even, arrived over American soil. And it sounds like an awesome, like movie plot. The problem with SDI was that you had a number of American scientists go on record as saying, that's an awesome idea, people, but we don't really have the ability to do that with our current technology, and we'd probably need about a good 10 more years of research and development before we could even consider an idea like that being reality or even being economically feasible. And so it gets the nickname Star Wars because maybe Reagan and his crew were watching too many George Lucas movies here and coming up with these cool sounding but impractical ideas on fighting in the Cold War. And so Star Wars was big in the current events of the 80s. Another big current event in the 80s is our political scandal for the decade. We had Watergate in the 70s, and in the 80s we have what's known as the Iran-Contra scandal. And so Iran and Contra are actually unrelated ideas that come together in one wonderfully packaged government scandal. And so what happened? Iran was a country that had been subjected to a lot of worldwide embargoes as a result of various wars that it was involved in the Middle East, and a number of terrorist groups that were living and operating within its borders. Whether or not those terrorist groups were running the Iranian government is questionable, but it wasn't the Iranian government doing much about them existing there. And so in the 80s, we actually have 6 Americans that are taken hostage by an extremist group in Iran known as Hezbollah. That's actually a terrorist group that still operates and functions within the Middle East today. But officials inside of Reagan's administration decided that they would try to get these hostages back by offering to sell Iran weapons. And so the deal was we would secretly sell Iran weapons if they would go negotiate on our behalf with Hezbollah to get these Americans back, the American hostages released. And so the Iranian government, of course, was like, yeah, sure, we'll do that. What can we buy from you? And so we had, the sale of weapons to, a nation state that was under world watch for its activities. And in hopes that they could negotiate with terrorists to get hostages back. And so that's how we get the Iran part of the Iran-Contra scandal, this kind of ethically questionable sale of weapons to Iran. The Contra part comes in when members of the National Security Council, one of them being Oliver North, a high-ranking Army official. You can see his picture under Ronald Reagan's there. That's when he was testifying in front of Congress regarding his involvement in this scandal. the National Security Council, a lot of the advisors decided that they could take the money that Iran paid us for these weapons and funnel it into anti-communist rebels who were fighting in Central America. And so that's where you get Contra, and that these anti-communist rebel group that operated primarily out of Nicaragua refer to themselves as the Contras. And so this would be perfect, right? Because the American people and Congress, they don't even know we have this extra cash because they don't know we sold the weapons to Iran. So this is all like off the books, kind of under the table deals. And so the National Security Council, like certain members were funneling this weapons money down to the Contras. Okay, so the Contras were rebels that weren't communist. That didn't mean that they were good people. And so the scandal receives tons of criticism on that front, and that the Contras were notorious for kidnapping and killing civilians wherever they happened to be fighting for freedom. You couldn't see my finger quotes there, but I used them. They, raped women, they killed children, they stole, so raping and pillaging under the guise of freedom seems kind of unethical. Not kind of, it is unethical. And so there's the problem. And the American people once again become angry with the fact that, government officials are just kind of making up their own rules and doing what they want and not consulting with our legislative branch of government when they're doing it. And so this becomes a big issue in the 1980s. As for how involved Ronald Reagan was with all of this, we don't really know. It's kind of like Nixon with Watergate. Like, could it really be happening under his nose and he's that clueless as to what was going on? Like, did they keep it hidden from him? Or was it one of these things that he kind of turned a blind eye to it? And so I guess that's something that we'll probably never actually know. The Cold War is going to start to come to an end here at the end of the 1980s. You can see the picture under Oliver North of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification of East and West Germany. Remember, Germany had been divided up into communist and non-communist countries at the end of World War II, and the capital city of Berlin likewise had been divided into East and West Berlin. And so when the Berlin Wall comes down and Germany becomes one, the world is watching to see if the domino effect can work in reverse. Like, can the fall of one communist country lead to the subsequent fall of others, like the Soviet Union? So the Cold War won't officially come to a close until we see the Soviet Union cease to exist in the 90s. So we'll see that in our last slideshow. But our final bullet here for the 1980s are three disasters that occur in the 1980s, but were very big current events, obviously. And so the first listed there, Challenger, is the space shuttle explosion in 1986. Remember that 7 astronauts or crew members die as a result of that explosion. Less than 2 minutes after takeoff. That is, as we discussed when we were talking about 9/11, that is my quote-unquote 9/11 of my childhood, and that I, like you, on 9/11 was an elementary school student sitting in school and watching, unfortunately, the Challenger explode on live TV right in front of me. And so that was a particularly hard blow to the American spirit. The space program never fully recovers from the Challenger explosion, and you actually have the space program completely grounded for about 2.5 years after that explosion. And so the end of our kind of love and obsession with space as the final frontier to explore, that dream kind of ends with that disaster. Chernobyl is the nuclear power plant explosion that happened in the Ukraine in 1986. Hundreds of people are dying as a result of that power plant explosion. Thousands more die indirectly as a result of radiation exposure. And hundreds of thousands are still feeling the effects in the form of radiation-induced cancers that still, exist in the area today. The Ukraine and Belarus being the areas that were most affected, and parts of Russia as well. And so the world was really, trying to tune into that current event to see, what would happen. It's one of the reasons nuclear power never really takes off as a reliable form of energy. And it's also attributed to the Cold War coming to an end, in that the Soviet Union, the country in control of the Ukraine at the time, tried to hide this from the world, and was very reluctant to release pictures or footage or information regarding Chernobyl. And so the Soviet Union gets a lot of criticism from the world as a result of how they handled the Chernobyl disaster. And so some historians will say that's part of the reason that the Cold War will finally come to an end, with the Soviet Union's huge hit in credibility because of their mishandling of Chernobyl. The last disaster mentioned here is Exxon Valdez. That, prior to the BP oil spill a few years ago, was the worst environmental disaster in human history. Exxon is the oil company that owned the ship, and the ship's name was the Valdez. And so this was an oil tanker that spilled millions of gallons of oil into the Pacific Ocean as a result of crashing into a coral reef. And so instantly rumors swirled in the media of some drunk captain that fell asleep at the wheel. And those rumors were actually perpetuated by Exxon themselves. They were trying to throw their own employee under the media bus, so to speak. Honestly, the captain wasn't on duty at the time. It was his third mate. And the crew was fatigued as Exxon had been reducing staff size and downsizing, and so that boat was running on a skeleton crew. Most of the guys weren't getting enough sleep. The radar system on that boat had been busted for about 2 years, and even though the crew, the captain included, kept saying to the company, like, you need to fix this so we don't crash into icebergs and stuff in the ocean, Exxon, in an attempt to save money, just didn't fix it. And so Exxon's wonderful business practices really come under fire here after the oil spill of the Exxon Valdez. Okay, and so a lot here for the 1980s, but let me know what questions you have over either this part or part one. Thanks for listening.